Hey, what's up, party pagans? I'm Jeremy Schumacher. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist. I am back with another video talking about whatever pops into my head that I think might make an interesting video. I am a specialist in working with couples, hence the marriage and family therapy licensure. I also have a specialty working with religious trauma, which I did a previous video on, and I have a specialty and lived experience with ADHD, which is what we're going to talk about today, kind of the intersection between Atheopaganism and ADHD. Whenever I talk about neurodivergence, I always start by just highlighting what my other neurodivergent folks and lots of neurotypical folks are aware of, is that this is going to be based predominantly on my experience. I am a therapist. I am drawing from a wealth of knowledge and experience working in the mental health field, but when working with something like ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, sensory processing disorders, dyslexia, stuff like that, we as a profession in the mental health field are pretty far behind on the research, where I usually say psychology is about 20 years behind pop culture or culture at large. So things like ADHD, autism spectrum, with the rise of the internet, especially things like social media, Instagram, TikTok, where regular people know about some of these things, and where the field has solid research, not like nobody's researching it, just research study and good research that then is peer reviewed, that then is done again to just double check. It's really like that takes time. So the field is behind, and so understand I'm going to talk about this from the perspective of lived experience, along with the sprinkling of what I know about it through research and stuff like that. But that was a really big caveat to open up. ADHD is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It's a really bad moniker. It really does not describe what it is like to live with ADHD. It's really written from a perspective of people who are diagnosing someone with ADHD, a school teacher, a therapist, a school psychologist, somebody who's having to deal with an ADHD brain in a setting that isn't designed for an ADHD brain. So that hyperactivity thing, like, a lot of folks with ADHD don't really feel hyperactive, but that's kind of the basis of the diagnosis. That's where a lot of people experience it, is having to sit still for a long time when you're not having a lot of stimulation going on. So as a field, what we know now is much better is dopamine regulation is really what the issue is, and that shows up in a lot of ways of executive dysfunction. The executive functioning part of our brain is where time management comes from, where problem solving can come from, where organizing complex tasks can come from, and that's where the dysregulation really kicks in. And I talk about a lot through my own lived experience and understanding the diagnosis on a clinical level. Like, there's a lot of sensory issues that also go along with that, but that doesn't get talked about too much outside of sensory processing disorders or certain levels of diagnosis with autism spectrum disorder, where we'll see sensory issues. But for a lot of my ADHD folks that I work with, a lot of the folks who are diagnosed later in life with ADHD, there's a high prevalence of sensory issues that go along with it. And the couple of years I've spent in the Pagan community, I find a lot of other neurodivergent folks. So I don't know if that's a quirk of me being neurodivergent, and I always say neurodivergent brains find each other, or if there's also some overlap there. I've seen one research paper on it that, again, wasn't like a gold star research. That wasn't the point of the paper. So again, it's a thing that I think is maybe not studied a ton. We're learning some of the links between gender nonconforming and autism spectrum disorder, and like, that's good. That's not great to pair a disorder with that right away, but that's what we have with the DSM in America, that we have the medical model for mental health. So it's flawed from the get-go. And like, that's one of the other things I like to throw out for a caveat here when I'm talking about this topic, is like, because I'm a professional, I do use the clinical language, I do use what's in the DSM, even though I dislike very strongly the deficit model that it uses. I don't like the medical model. I work from a strengths-based approach, but semantics being what they are, trying to use language that means a agreed upon definition. So this is a fun topic so far. So one of the things that I think a lot of ADHDers will struggle with is consistency. And so when we talk about something like Atheopaganism, one of our principles is praxis, right? So engaging in your regular pagan practice, whether that's solo practice or that's in a group. And one of those things that can be really hard when you have dopamine dysregulation, when you have executive dysfunction, is getting into a habit with things. Habits aren't necessarily super easy to do when you have a dysregulated brain, when your brain is not supplying you with the regular amount of dopamine, when you don't know what your brain's going to feel like in the morning when you wake up, when you don't know a certain task is going to take extra dopamine or not. So it can be really taxing and quite impractical to think of it as on a daily basis, I'm doing this. And that was one of the things that I struggled with first when I found Atheopaganism, was like, I don't really do anything every day. Pretty good about brushing my teeth. I think I brush my teeth every day. But that's sensory based because I hate the way my teeth feel when they're gritty. You don't know that that's habit based. I also shower a lot because I have weird things about having stuff on my skin. So again, like there's this huge variance within the neurodivergent community. For ADHD by itself in the DSM, which is deeply flawed, there's 20 different diagnostic criteria. You only need 6 of them to get a diagnosis. So a bunch of people and I could get together, all have ADHD, formally diagnosed, and have very few overlapping symptoms, which is crazy to me. So again, like I might be talking about some of these things and be like, I don't have that. That's weird. I have ADHD. Jeremy seems weird. And that's fine. That's why I like neurodivergence as semantics, as a phrase that we use now to kind of broaden that scope and say like, hey, these things exist on a spectrum. It's okay that you're not the same as someone else. The clinical examples we have are pretty limited, or the clinical model we use is pretty limited. So lots of other things out there. But for me, that idea of praxis was really hard at first. And to be honest, like not a ton better. I do a daily tarot card pull, but like for me, that's really habitual with having young kids, like just having a way to kind of structure our morning. We like to light the candle together. Everybody takes a turn blowing out the candle. So like it's structured and regulated through body doubling, you know? So if you're not familiar with what body doubling is, it's a thing that a lot of ADHDers find a lot of benefit from. We get dopamine from having social expectations or from having other people around. So whether we're body doubling in person or we're body doubling virtually, we can be a little bit more effective at getting tasks that are not real exciting or aren't very stimulating, don't provide much dopamine in and of themselves. We can do some of that through having somebody do a task with us, or just sit with us, or be present while we're doing a task while they're doing a task. So that's what body doubling is. It's really having somebody else there with you while you're trying to complete a task. So I find that including my boys on some of these things can kind of function as that body doubling. For some of you, if you are in a group practice, or if you have a group of pagans that you meet with regularly, you might find that that's actually easier to engage in your practice that way, through that social setting, than by yourself. And one of the paradoxical things with ADHD is that it's just not consistent. So there are also probably times, or for some folks out there, who the group meetings are actually really taxing, and that maybe is hard to stick with just because the social component of it seems like it's so much extra work. So lots of fun with the various ways that this can pop up for people. Some of the other things that I think can pop up, I think a lot of people are drawn to paganism. For a lot of ADHDers are drawn to it because nature is really stimulating. So for me, I've always known that fire and water are things that are really powerful for me. Not necessarily powerful in like a magical sense, but just in a like, I feel really good around those things. And looking at it through the lens of my ADHD diagnosis, like right, fire is always moving. There's lots of sensory input that goes along with that. So it's very stimulating. There's a certain smell to wood burning. Different woods have different smells. The sap getting heating up and popping and crackling in the fire. Rebuilding the fire. I love to putz with the fire once it's going. I like to add more logs and reshape it and rebuild it as things are burning. And the fire itself is always moving. It's also very visually stimulating. So all that stuff is great. Water, similarly, always moving, lots of sensory input. Salt water has a different smell than fresh water, has a different smell than being in a city going down a river on a paddleboard. So the lots of different sensory input, the spray, the sense of water, of getting wet, the sound of waves moving, the visual of waves moving, of nature, whether it's seaweed or it's plant life, algae, whatever it is, and then fish and all these other things, birds coming in and landing on the water. There's a lot of sensory input. There's a lot of stimuli that comes from being on the water. And for those of us with ADHD, with a lot of stimuli usually comes a lot of dopamine. We like things that are stimulating. And then paradoxically, when we get overstimulated, it becomes much more taxing for us to deal with that than maybe somebody who's neurotypical and has that brain regulation that's providing them with a consistent amount of dopamine so that they can have a little bit more runway and realize before they're getting overstimulated, and then also have some more resources available to work with that overstimulation. Where a lot of times for ADHDers, it's just like we're overstimulated, and that's very big and that's very bad very suddenly. So again, even when I'm talking about ADHD, I'm like, hey, this is good for ADHDers. I'm quick to point out that, like, for some people, it can feel a lot differently in some of these settings. So again, understanding that this is my experience, and yes, I can explain psychologically why that might feel that way for me, and it's okay if that feels differently for you. So one of the things that I think with something like paganism that can be really powerful for a neurodivergent brain is some of these things providing that intentional outlet, that stimulation that we're looking for, or that lack of stimulation we're looking for, that safe haven. If I'm overstimulated socially, my social battery is very low. I know that getting my dogs and going for a walk through the woods can be really soothing for me. So talking about the difference between like regulating something like dopamine for an ADHD brain, which is usually dysregulated, and also something like regulating our nervous system. So we talk about regulation a lot, or at least I do in the therapy. Especially that overlap with like ADHD and also religious trauma. So trauma, we're talking about regulating the nervous system a lot. ADHD, we're talking about regulating your dopamine levels a lot. And so that balancing act between, are we trying to regulate our nervous system? Are we trying to regulate our dopamine? Those behaviors might not always be the same. And so just being intentional and having some different outlets available. I think other things that are nature-based can be really stimulating. So for example, I grew up in a high control religion. I did not learn science very well. I was raised young earth creationist, biblical literalist. So my version of learning about space had to make sense through a biblical lens, which means I don't know a lot about space, even at my current age. Space is still a really fascinating topic. So when you have an earth-based spirituality, when you have something that's rational-based, science can be really stimulating. So like the James Webb telescope and all the information we're getting from that has been like so fascinating and so stimulating for me. I could look at those pictures for a really long time and not get bored with them. And so again, I think it's one of those things where we think of ADHD as like moving a lot, always needing more new stimuli. But a lot of times it's not just the amount of stimuli, but also the quality of stimuli. So daily social norms like small talk are really boring for me and they're really hard for my brain to get through. But finding someone else who's going to talk to me about space or talk to me about, you know, what plants are in bloom or what fungi are growing or where it's at in forage season. Like a lot of those things are really fascinating because they're changing constantly, they're updating constantly, there's different seasons and geography to them. There's all these different variables. And so that information becomes very stimulating. You can have really stimulating conversation around that. Neurodivergent folks are less likely to follow social norms because it's going to be more difficult for their brain to fit into a specific box and do it consistently. And so again, breaking some of those social norms might be common among pagans because they're not following a certain religious overculture. They're not ascribing to a privileged set of knowledge or a colonized set of knowledge. They might be more interested in something else that's specific to them or specific to their cultural heritage, their indigenous background, if that's a thing. And so looking at some of those things from a pagan lens could also overlap with a neurodivergent lens, in that we're moving away from some of the social norms. We're engaging with things that we find particularly meaningful or stimulating for us outside of what society at large has decided is okay. I'm a therapist. I've made my career around having conversations that don't follow social constructs and social norms. Like, I joke with people, at this point in my career, I'm more comfortable doing a suicide assessment than I am having small talk. And like, that's a dark joke, right? Like, too late to do a trigger warning. But like, again, as a therapist, you get kind of desensitized stuff like that. And for me, like, those are the conversations that it's a joke, because I don't necessarily enjoy those. I don't want people to be struggling or thinking about that level of crisis with their mental health. But like, those conversations for me are easier to engage with and to have than like social norms, big question mark. Like, oh, we're supposed to talk about the weather, but like, not like talk about how terrible climate change is, because that's taxing for other people. So you're not supposed to have that conversation. You're supposed to talk about like whatever it is outside, and like, I'm Midwest nice on top of it then. So like, we also have to have a joke or like have a witty banter about it. It can't just be like a thing. So again, social norms for neurodivergent folks are tough to follow. Even as I'm talking about what I think my basic understanding of social norms are, gets kind of messy. But again, so some of this stuff can overlap really nicely, I think, between like the pagan spaces and the neurodivergent spaces, which is why neurodivergent folks and neurodivergent brain types might be overrepresented in pagan spaces. Having not a set rule, there's not a holy scripture to follow. There's not one set of rules to follow. There's not one agreed upon leader to be following, which means there are fewer social norms to be following, which for neurodivergent folks might be really nice and feel very freeing and also feel very inclusive. I also think it's work for those of us in these pagan spaces, atheopagans, to maintain that inclusivity. It can be easy for in-group, out-group dynamics to pop up around anything, but especially around spirituality and religion. Organized religions operate almost exclusively around in-group, out-group dynamics. And so being wary of getting dogmatic about that stuff and trying to actually be intentional with holding spaces for neurodivergent folks, understanding that ritual might affect neurodivergent brains differently. Some people might do really well with ritual, and ritual could be really overstimulating for certain folks. And so I think just being aware of that stuff, it's okay to ask questions. It's okay to not be an expert on anything. I'm quote unquote an expert from society's lens around mental health. And even I will say, like, there's so much about it when I first meet someone and they say, oh, I'm ADHD, or I'm on the spectrum, or I have depression, or I have anxiety, or whatever it is. My first question is often, I don't always do anything. My first question is often, what does that mean to you? Because even though I know what the DSM says about it, what our diagnostic manuals say about it, what insurance companies say about it, that doesn't mean that I know what it means to you specifically. So there's a lot of nuance and variability around the topic of neurodivergence. And so I think, like, just checking in with people. A lot of this is relational. One person who is on the autism spectrum might respond differently than another. One person who has ADHD is going to respond differently than someone else who has ADHD about some of this stuff. So as you're building ritual, as you're building community, or connecting with different people from different communities, whether it's online or in person, I think having some of these conversations is good. Finding out what works for people, what doesn't work for people, and just trying to take that stuff into account. It's okay to mess it up. It's okay to not get it right. It's okay to not always know that it's even a thing, because again, sometimes if you don't have that lived experience, it's really hard to know it, because the research is so far behind. And unless you've engaged with somebody who is of a certain neurotype, you might not even know that it's a thing. So I think it's work to hold these spaces and to grow these spaces and to try and be intentional with building these spaces out. Again, I'm that societal level expert on this thing. I've had lived experience. I had ADHD my whole life. And there's still things that I'm making sense of now at 35 that I've been in the mental health field for 15 years. got my diagnosis 12, 13 years ago. I left religion 5, 6 years ago. So like organized religion 5, 6 years ago. And that leaving religion, a high control religion, actually helped me get in touch with my body in a different way, which actually then led to me understanding my ADHD diagnosis through a different lens and actually experiencing it a bit differently because I was in touch with my body in a different way. So as people connect with themselves, as people find a spirituality that's authentic and genuine, might actually change the way they relate to their own neurodivergent brain. So there's so much variability that goes into this, and can get really complex really quickly. I'm smiling because I'm just reflecting on what I started this video on, and the topic I thought I was going to go with is not where I ended, and I'm probably at a point where I should wrap it up so I'm not just meandering aimlessly for an hour talking about ADHD, which is a topic I'm super passionate about. This is a super broad topic. I think I mentioned it in my introduction with religious trauma, and there were a couple people who dropped down in the comments, which I super appreciate, and wrote about wanting to hear more. That's super helpful for me. I can talk pretty much for hours on end about these topics, but love to kind of tailor fit what I'm talking about to what people will think are helpful. I'm really used to doing this in a therapeutic space, in a one-on-one space, or a small group type space. So trying to approach it from a level of a couple hundred people on YouTube, or a couple thousand people on the Facebook group or Discord, or wherever you're tuning in from. So if you've got questions, or you got concerns, you got topics you would like me to discuss, I'm happy to do that. I find content creation is a little easier with direct feedback. I can hone in on a topic a little bit more directly instead of just having to pull it out of my brain specifically, which my brain's inconsistent. It's based very much on where I'm at on that time and space and when I'm making a video. So appreciate people engaging and commenting, and appreciate being a part of this community. So thanks for taking the time, and any interaction in the comments is appreciated. All right. Take care, y'all. Peace.